good evening to everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'm Caroline Hanks of Herefordshire Meadows, one of the partners in Meadow Makers, and I'm your chair for this evening. So together with Plant Life, the Meadow Makers Partnership, we'd like to welcome you to this webinar on grassland carbon, which we've titled very loosely, Restoration, Creation and Management Practices that Affect Carbon Sequestration and Storage in Grasslands. A little bit about Meadow Makers first. It is led by Plant Life and funded through DEFRA's Green Recovery Challenge Fund. It's a project working to restore species-rich grassland across England. There are 7 delivery partners, and the project includes the restoration of 500 hectares of species-rich grassland on over 100 sites. The nationwide engagement programme is connecting 7,000 people in local and wider communities to grassland heritage. Excuse me, I'm very sorry. I've committed the cardinal sin for chairman, and I'm just going to switch that off.
Throw it out the window, Caroline. I
thought about throwing it downstairs. Going down here. Apologies. So as well as the nationwide engagement programme connecting 7,000 people in the community to grassland heritage, there's also a very strong element of skill development, knowledge exchange and digital collaboration. The knowledge exchange element is what's led us here tonight, because many of our partners and the Meadow Makers themselves in this project have been asking questions that we can't easily answer about grassland carbon, how they can help to build up the evidence base as Meadow Makers themselves transform their grassland from species poor to species rich. So this evening's webinar, which is being recorded and the link will be shared with you afterwards, is the first step to bring us all up to speed to understand the role that grasslands play. So first, we've 2 speakers this evening who are Penny Anderson and Phil Wilson. And then we're going to have a Q&A panel made up of our 2 speakers and also Bill Grayson and Lisa Norton as well. And we're aiming to finish at 8:30. So we'd like to invite you to put your questions this evening into the Q&A, where Matt Pitts from Plant Life, who is also here on the screen, and Claire Cornish from Cumbria Wildlife Trust and Isabel Hall from Plant Life will be kindly preparing the questions to go to the panel. So I'm going to now do a very brief introduction to our speakers, who I know will set the context of their talks and an introduction to themselves at the beginning of their talks. But I'd like to start with Penny Anderson, who's a nature conservationist who throughout her career as an ecological consultant and in habitat management has combined scientific rigour with very practical solutions in the field. And she's brought both these really key skills to a recent CEIEEM paper on carbon and ecosystems that she wrote last year, and which she's based her talk on this evening. So welcome to Penny. Phil Wilson is a freelance ecologist who concentrates on farmland ecology in all its breadth, and he blends this with his own livestock farming in Devon. And he's presenting his soon-to-be published report based on Natural England data sets, which are really relevant to our discussion this evening. So welcome to Phil. Bill Grayson came to farming from an ecological and scientific background, and he's at the forefront of combining nature conservation and farming through the knowledge that he shares so generously on the Nibblers Forum and with the PFLA and the many organisations who benefit from the service that he and his wife Kath provide on, I think it's 650 hectares of land that these organisations own through their Morecambe Bay Conservation Grazing Company. So welcome, Bill. And Lisa Norton is a landscape ecologist. Can I call you an agroecologist as well, working at CEH in Lancaster? She's, amongst many things that she's worked on, she's worked with the UK Countryside Survey, who've gathered data which has synergy with what we're discussing this evening. And also she's worked with the PFLA more recently to evidence and investigate the aspects of livestock farming that can provide ecosystem services as part of the solution to the ecological and climate emergency, which I think ultimately is is partly why we're here this evening as well. So welcome, Lisa. Welcome everybody everybody else. Welcome to you all this evening. Penny's going to go first. So Penny, if we can ask you to get your slides up on the screen, please. And then we'll start with your talk.
Thank you. Just reading.
Great.
Right, do I need to just switch it around again?
I think you may need to, yes. Isn't that funny that, there we go.
Yeah, is that that's okay, is it now?
Yes, we can just see your slide and I'll disappear at the side and we'll leave you to give your, we're here listening to your talk. Thank you, Penny.
Thank you. Otherwise, it feels like you're sitting talking to a dark room, doesn't it, really? But anyway, yeah. So thank you very much, and delighted to see so many people here tonight as well. It's quite amazing. I was going to introduce myself, but Caroline's done it very efficiently. I don't know where she found all that lovely information, so I won't say no to it. But I think the important bit, which had really led me into the interest in carbon, was I specialised in peatland restoration for 40 odd years when I was working. I'm supposed to be retired now, though it doesn't always feel like it. And then I joined the group called the 2030 Group, which is a climate change action group for CEcol, which is our professional institute, for those who don't know it, Chartered Institute of Ecology and Environmental Managers. And from that led me into looking at the issue of wider issue, not just of peatlands, but of carbon, soils and habitats. And I produced the review paper, which it's free to download if you want it, but beware, it's about 20,000 words, so it's not just like bedtime reading. But what I did was a review, which means I'm extremely well read, although I can't remember half of it, but I'm not an expert. So please bear that in mind when you ask the right questions of the wrong person, like me. What I did find, though, and I think it's a really serious and really important, is that all know about the urgency for action in relation to both the biodiversity crisis and the climate emergency. But I feel that there's great opportunities to combine the solutions to both, particularly in nature-based solutions. And many of those actually also contribute to a wide range of ecosystem services, so other benefits to the environment, particularly in relation to flood control and water quality, which is where I first came in the peatland restoration work for the water companies, but also in terms of pollinators. And we shouldn't forget about health and well-being either, because it's really important for people to have really attractive environments to visit. And we know that the more flowers there are, the more birds and butterflies and so on they are, the more value that is, in fact, to health and well-being. Let's just start, though, with looking at where the carbon actually is, and some of you will know this anyway, but globally there's about 3 to 5 times more carbon in soils than there is in vegetation, and indeed 2 to 3 times more in soils than in the atmosphere, which just goes to stress how important soils are throughout, and the world is all habitats in terms of the carbon and where it is. And we talk about the carbon stock, which is the total amount of carbon in the habitats and the soils at any one point in time. Don't forget that that can go up and down, so it is just a point in time. And that's usually measured as tons of carbon per hectare. And then we talk about carbon sequestration, and that's actually the capturing of carbon and actually combining it into the trees, the wood and the soils in particular. So that's the amount captured, and that's measured as tons of carbon per hectare per year. In terms of the greenhouse gas emissions, though, that there's other factors to incorporate, such as the methane and the nitrous oxides, but I'm not dealing with that particularly here. But if we just look at the carbon cycle, which I'm sure will be familiar to everybody, but the important points is the balance between the amount of carbon dioxide that the green plants capture, make into carbohydrates, and then the amount that's actually of that carbon dioxide is then released in respiration of the plants, the microbes, the fungi, the soil invertebrates, and so on. And it's the balance between those that then hopefully will leave some carbon in the soil, because not all of it's going to be respired back out again. And I don't know whether you also knew that many plants actually exude carbohydrates through their root systems. And so the fine roots of the plants, of all plants, trees, shrubs, grasses, everything, are really, really important. And they actually feed, particularly the fungi, but a lot of the soil organisms. And the fungi break that down to form polymers, which then are used by the microbes. So it's the amount of CO2 that's entering through that cycle into the soil, which is going to be really important for the carbon cycle. So if we just look at some of the key points of carbon in soils, we have to separate mineral soils from organic soils because they function in a different way. The mineral soils, the carbon is in the soil organic matter, but also in the mineral associated organic matter, that's the MAOM. And that, associated particularly with clay soils and fine aggregate soils, actually has a carrying capacity, or it is, most people believe it has, although there is some querying of that actually that I've seen in papers recently. In comparison with that, the organic soils are essentially undecomposed material which accumulates on top of the soils, and that can actually continue to accumulate provided the conditions for that accumulation are appropriate. Another really important point is an awful lot of the papers that I read, particularly the earlier ones, were looking at carbon in the top 15 centimetres up to 30 centimetres, but there's about 50 to 60, and it's nearer 60, particularly in grasslands, of that carbon is actually below that level. So the whole soil profile, right down to a metre or more, can be really, really important. That obviously depends very much on the soils, soil type, the geology, the depth of the soils, and so on. At the same time, soil carbon actually varies considerably with climate. There's more in wetter climates, for example. With soil type, there's more in high clay content soils. With a fungal component, which is a really important part of the whole system, and with the vegetation and its management. So what I've done here is just to give you a few examples of a range of carbon measures from soils, some of them with varying depths, I'm afraid. I haven't managed to moderate them so that they're all the same. So the middle column in particular, but regard it as indicative because there's a very wide range in lots of different literature. It's not always clear what the soil types necessarily are or where they are actually in the country in terms of their geography and their climate. And sometimes some of these figures might come from Europe as well. But the ones right at the top of the scale there, they're the humic alluvial glaze soils, so the ones with a good organic matter layer and with a lot of clay in, and peatland. Now peatland could actually be the top in terms of the amount of carbon. This is the carbon stock, but that depends entirely on the depth of the peat and the density of the carbon in the peat as well. So those are the top two. Podsols, which is an example of a sort of podsol on the right hand side here in the photograph, can be really important again because they accumulate an organic matter layer on top. But the levels in woodland can be quite high, and in fact it's quite important to realise that, and I've seen bigger figures than this as well, quite important to realise that the woodland soil carbon tends to be higher than the above ground. If you just looked at the figure on the right hand side, the 81 to 251 tonnes of carbon per hectare. So that makes, it doesn't look like it, doesn't feel like it, does it intuitively when you go into a woodland, but in fact the woodland soils, and particularly broadleaf woodland more than conifers, deeper roots and a longer time to get them there as well, and the bigger root mat, there's more carbon in the soils than there is in the rest of the woodland above ground. And then you've got a variety of grasslands, the acid grassland, calcareous, neutral grassland. Again, these are very shallow depths, and I've seen figures today, for example, of acid grassland of higher than that. Neutral grasslands, I've seen a figure today, I think, of 190 tonnes of carbon per hectare, down to a metre. So again, very variable amounts, and you can expect that to vary anyway from west to east, north to south, and in altitude as well. And at the bottom of the list is the arable, and the arable stocks are actually quite low because the organic matter level's quite low as well. But if you then compare that with the carbon in the vegetation on the right hand side, you will see that the majority of herbaceous vegetation is actually a very, very small component of that carbon stock. And it's only when you get woody vegetation, so a medium level in the heaths and a much higher level in woodland, bigger in an old broadleaf mixed woodland, more semi-natural woodland, than in a conifer plantation. But again, remember that's only one point in time, and with a plantation and forestry, then that time might be a fairly short cycle. If things like Sitka spruce are taken out at something like 40-45 years, they don't even get to their maximum sequestration rates before they're then harvested. And what becomes of them after that harvest depends, then dictates really what happens to the carbon. Is it burnt? Does it go into paper, short-term carbon products, or does it go into something long-lived like furniture or building? So very quickly, I've tried to summarize, and I'm not very good at doing these sorts of drawings, so I hope you're not colorblind either. So if you start at the green left-hand top corner, then you've got the plant material coming into the soils, dropped on the soils or into the soil, and then they're going to be changed through weathering and from microbial activity, and particularly the fungi. And the fungi transform the carbohydrates into carbon complexes, which end up in the humus. And it's those carbon complexes that are then used mostly by the microbes. And what's really important is that the microbes are the ones responsible for actually getting some of that carbon into the mineral associated organic matter. And that's the carbon that can actually last for hundreds or even up to thousands, they think, years. So that's actually can be quite stable unless it's disturbed in terms of ploughing or draining or something like that. And it's that incorporation of that organic material which actually provides this aggregation of soils and then gives you pores. And those pores in the soil are vital, and they give a stable environment for the roots and the microbes to live in. And they at the same time improve, we're in the green at the bottom now, improve the soil structure, the water retention and the nutrient exchange. And it's the location of a lot of biological activity. So that's really important. So I don't know very much more about it, so please don't ask, but you really need a good soil scientist to explain any further questions on that one, I think. Now, the other thing I think that's actually quite important that people tend to forget is that we all talk about the amount of sequestration or the amount of carbon stocks in a hectare of something or other. But then if you look over the country as a whole and look at the hectares of the different habitat types, and the examples I've given you here is just a calculation from a high value habitat. So it's not the majority of arable and agricultural land. But it's actually the key thing is the extent of those habitats multiplied by the potential stock of carbon that actually gives you the total for the whole country. And if we're talking about climate change and mitigation for that, and some sort of amelioration, which is desperate, as we saw in the report that came out yesterday, then it's the area that might be involved. And when you consider that grasslands in particular are one of the most widespread of habitats, of all sorts of grasslands, that is, across the whole of the UK, then even if you haven't got huge amounts of stock or huge levels of sequestration, you can still make a very significant difference simply because of the scale involved. So in the table that I've just given you, for example, the heathland comes out at top, because this is the UK as a whole, so there's a lot of heathland in Scotland and it's got high carbon stocks in it. So that actually beats blanket bog, if you like, which is at the top of the table there, simply because there's more of it. And if you look further down, the semi-natural grasslands, again, I think of the third on the list there, aren't they, with heath first, then bog, and then semi-natural grassland. Not because they've got a very high level of carbon stock in them, but because they're very large area at a medium level, which actually adds up. Whereas woodland actually comes out pretty close to the bottom, simply because there's not very much of it, even though its carbon levels might be quite high. And that, I think, is a really important point from yourselves for a grassland interest point of view. It's a scale. Now, the other thing to bear in mind that the carbon stock, as I keep saying, is what is there at one point in time when you've measured it, but it's actually extremely easy to lose it, to destroy it, or at least to destroy some of it. And there's a whole list of here of the sorts of things that can actually happen to do that. So habitat loss of any sort, so destruction of woodlands, grasslands, anything that's been fairly well established for some time, will have some sort of carbon in it. And of course, the more mature and the older the woodlands, for example, the more carbon you're losing, particularly when you're destroying the soils as well. You know, think of HS2, for example. We won't talk about that now. If you also change that land use from that habitat, whatever it is, to arable, and if that arable involves regular ploughing, then you're actually going to destroy a lot of the carbon at the same time. And that goes for most soil disturbance, for example, ploughing or drainage. And some of these effects, drainage particularly, can actually last a very long time, more than 10 years, for example, or longer, depending on how effective in drainage terms it is. You can also lose carbon quite extensively through soil loss, and that could be in sediment or erosion, and on peatlands, it's wind blown as well, as you can see perhaps on the Cambridgeshire Fens, somewhere like that. And there's some picture at the bottom here of an appallingly recent, just down the road from me, drainage here, which is obviously sending off quite a lot of water through very thick, wet clay soils. But wildfire is another major effect, particularly when you've got this climate change and warming, And so you might have heard, or you probably saw, at least on satellites, the Saddleworth Moor fire in 2018. And this is a picture taken in 2019. And the Moors for the Future have calculated something like 12,000 tons of carbon were lost from 660 hectares. And you can see something up to a foot or more of actual peat being destroyed by that fire. And then after the fire, you'll then have wind and rain, which is going to make it a lot worse. Other ways of reducing potentially the amount of carbon stock is perhaps overgrazing, because high grazing levels actually reduce the rooting depth of your grasslands, for example, and it can also increase the nitrogen problems, and you're going to have increases of the methane emissions as well. Drought is actually a major problem, because if the soils dry out, which are normally wet, particularly peatland, then the decay of the carbon in the peat and the decay of organic matter can actually happen quite quickly. And there's certainly some reports of losing something like 40 up to 60% of the carbon in some soils which have dried out too much. So lowland heathland could be particularly susceptible, as well as our blanket bogs, which are regularly set on fire, particularly in our area here in the Peak District. And then there's the peat erosion and decay, which is a long history of air pollution, wildfire, to a degree, but not hugely, managed burning, and all sorts of the other problems that peatland have had. But subject I could talk about for hours, but it's not the subject tonight, so I'll leave that one for the moment. And these are just to give you a little bit of flavour of what some of those carbon losses might be, taken from mostly from the recent review by Natural England, which is the Ruth Gregg's summary in 2021, published last year. And the one just to pick out is the one at the bottom, really, because lowland raised bogs converted to arable and deeply drained, like the Cambridgeshire fens and the Lancashire mosses, and can be losing something like 30 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent per hectare per year. So note that the measures have changed here. And this is actually to take into consideration the methane, because that's one of the major problems when you've got drained material, like the one second to bottom, flooded lowland peat after extraction, which happens quite a lot, particularly to make nature reserves, could actually be generating quite a lot of methane production from its habitat. So gullied blanket bog and lowland raised bogs are really severe losses of peat and carbon. And one of the most important things then is to try and restore that, to reduce that loss, rather than it sequestrating more, actually. But there's still appreciative levels. And incidentally, to very roughly convert those numbers to tonnes of carbon, divide by 3.667, which is not something that you can just do just like that on the top of your head. But anyway, that's what you need to do roughly. Right. So how can you maximise carbon capture in grasslands in particular? The most important thing, I think, is to protect the remaining habitats, because those are the ones that are already rich in carbon. They could be made richer sometimes, but if you're destroying them, you're losing it. So protecting the remaining habitats is really important. The second is to minimise soil disturbance, and that might be for any sort of habitat restoration, recreation, or any other works, really. The least disturbance you can do, the better in terms of disturbing the carbon that's already there when you're trying to achieve something else. The other thing is to think about your scale that I've mentioned already. If you can actually think about whether you can do something on a large scale, even if it's not a huge amount, maybe have hotspots like ponds or planting woodland and so on as well. But large-scale grassland restoration and management could actually reap quite a lot of benefits, I think. And then you also, I think it's valuable to note that optimizing that management to capture carbon usually also benefits biodiversity. One thing to note, though, is that it can take some years to start overall carbon capture after disturbance, and that depends really how much you've got to start with, how much you're losing, and then what the capacity of your new environment is going to be. And that's particularly relevant actually to woodland. Everybody's saying plant trees, plant trees, plant trees everywhere. But, and it captures the public imagination, it's an easy thing to get across as a message as well, isn't it? But it can take 10 to 30 years for the carbon budget of newly planted woodland, and that's whether it's plantation forestry or proper woodland, for that budget to be positive. In other words, for carbon to be captured as opposed to losing carbon for that sort of period of time. And if you were planting onto organic soils like pod soils and heathland, organic rich soils, you could actually never achieve a positive carbon budget. And that's why I think it's so important to have a range of other habitats that you can actually start looking at to restore, which would include grasslands of various sorts. Now, I've just given you a few figures here of just potential sequestration rates. So we're into tons of carbon per hectare per year now from different habitats, mostly again taken out of Ruth Gregg's Natural England report. The numbers do vary a lot though between different projects and different places. So this is a guideline, if you like. So looking at either acid grasslands or neutral grasslands, and the neutral grassland figure of 3.17 is actually one of the highest. And that's a neutral grassland with red clover added. And it was a report of an experiment done at Colt Park up in Yorkshire, which showed within a couple of years. So that's quite important to note that some of this grassland restoration, you could be achieving carbon sequestration much more quickly than you could in woodland. And I think that in itself is quite important because we haven't got time to wait for woodland to capture carbon in a positive fashion. We've got to get the carbon levels down now in the next 10 years. We haven't got time to wait for 20, 30 years. So it gives us a breathing space if we can do it through other means as well. Floodplain grasslands could be really, really important, which I know Caroline is delighted to hear, and she knows about anyway. And there's a floodplain partnership at the moment, which is looking at carbon amongst other things in terms of including restoration of flower-rich grassland in floodplains. And you could combine that with things like ponds and a little bit of planting and all sorts of other things as well. It doesn't have to just be grassland. So think of a complex mosaic of habitats. It is provided that the river is connected to its floodplain and can flood and therefore deposit sediment. And it has been shown that in fact you can build up carbon over hundreds of years on a floodplain. It doesn't have such a capacity because it's being regenerated all the time every time it's flooded. Those grasslands are also much more resilient to being flooded and will recover afterwards, which a ryegrass field or an arable crop doesn't. And it helps hold the soil together, so it has lots of other benefits as well. There's an interesting project called the Green Grass Project, which has taken the sort of transect of sites from Ireland, Scotland, right across Denmark and right across to Hungary, actually includes some high level and low level sites as well. Looking at a whole range of different grassland types from extensive to intensive, from high level of nitrogen additions to none, and with a variety of outputs as well. So the tons of carbon per hectare per year varies between 0.5 and 4. And that particular project actually also looked at the whole carbon cycle. So it included the management, the hay cutting and the stock. We'll come to that later. So there's a wide variety of measurements there. Heathland can be quite important, particularly when you've got a good scrubby small shrub cover. And then there's the plantations and things at the end. But the important thing there is just to see how grasslands fit into the whole of that. There's a lot of problems with measuring carbon sequestration in woodlands. A lot of it's been done by modelling. A lot of it's dependent on the Forestry Commission or Forest Research's work on plantations and a limited range of species. And that's not the same as creating woodland, and it's not the same as an existing ancient semi-natural woodland, for example. There's a dearth of information on those sorts of habitats. So be careful making comparisons. So how do you add carbon to your grasslands? The review that I've done, and the picture on the right is one that I have succeeded successfully in creating. It's about 20 years old now, so that's a nice one. But we've been discussing this between some of us this afternoon, actually, and this might come up again later, but I'm suggesting that we should be trying to establish permanent, not lay grasslands, because if every time you plough them up, you're going to lose some of the carbon that has actually just been set down over the previous few years. The research at the moment is suggesting that restoring plant diversity creating new flower-rich grasslands actually be able to sequestrate more carbon than monocultures or low diversity grasslands. And some research has suggested that they can actually carry on sequestrating carbon as well for a significant amount of time. We're talking decades, potentially 100 years or something like that. But at least, again, that gives us that breather before any of the woodlands and things mature. And one of the reasons might be there's a range of rooting depths, there's a range of rooting types, and it's been shown that you've got a much more diverse microbial activity when you've got a more diverse range of rooting depths. And some of the floodplain grassland work has been showing that as well as other sites too. So the sorts of sites to target where you're going to actually make the most or have the most impact, potentially capture the most carbon, would be clay-rich soils, floodplains, provided they're connected to their rivers, and perhaps more the wetter climates rather than the drier climates. But on the other hand, if you were to restore arable to grasslands on sandy soils, there's been some work done that suggests that sandy soils have been losing their carbon about 2% per year for the last 80 years, whereas clay soils have been losing theirs at a much lower rate. So you've got a much quicker gain, but the gain won't be so great on a sandy soil. So it makes it worthwhile doing, but you just need to remember that context. Another impact that's coming out of quite a lot of the reviews is that if you've got low inorganic fertilizer or no inorganic fertilizer, then you're actually going to end up with a higher level of carbon sequestration as well. If you have your levels of nitrogen too high, you have much higher turnover of the organic matter. You've got much more competitive, vigorous, fast turnover plants like ryegrass, for example. Slurry is not good, but low levels of manure can be good for carbon. If you can add legumes, so especially your deep-rooted ones like red clover and Bursfoot trefoil is a deep-rooted one as well, which refers back to those coal park experiments I mentioned. Reducing your high stocking levels, as I've suggested just now, but that can actually take some time to respond. Reducing drainage effects, so you don't dry out completely, you maintain some moisture in the soil. And then your carbon capture can actually start fairly quickly, as long as you don't do too much disturbance. And then Caroline's just appeared, which presumably means I've run out of time.
Yes, the 1 minute, two or 1 minute warning for Penny, yeah. But
okay, this is the last one anyway.
Lovely.
The benefits of adding carbon to grasslands, I think, will come out fairly clearly from what I've just been saying. There'll be a high biodiversity gain, but also the other ecosystem services with increased flood control. You've got much better permeability of your soils with a higher organic matter in it, for example, with lots of pollinators. And this is one of my restored meadows on the right-hand photograph as well, with lots of red clover in it, as you can see. You get more immediate carbon sequestration than you would do under the afforestation type schemes, which we've already mentioned. And those sequestration rates can equal those of woodland, but woodlands are going to be higher in their highest growth period, but that is not forever. You could include other habitats within your grassland schemes, those trees along boundaries, scrub, hedges, and so on, which will add to some more carbon as well. And I think you can actually do carbon restoration for grasslands at a much larger scale. And then you've got the other benefits too. But I think the most important thing as well to consider is that all I've talked about so far is carbon stocks and carbon sequestration. I have not incorporated the other greenhouse gases, so particularly the nitrous oxides and the methane, which will be potentially a result of management in particular. But there's about 3 projects I've found recently, actually, including the green grass project that I mentioned earlier, where the suggestion was that the reduction in the sequestration values were in the region of 18 to 21% if you took into consideration the management through particularly cattle, because they produce the higher level of methane compared with some other stock. And that was where I was going to stop, Caroline.
Fantastic, Penny. That's really wonderful background and insight with that grassland, the attention to the grassland and the emphasis on that. And thank you so much for extracting that from your broader paper, which that's really absolutely what we needed to get us started. So thank you. We're going to go over to Phil's talk now. So I'm going to ask Phil to there with his screen. While he's getting his slides ready, we had one question for Penny, which is about about trees. Perhaps we should come back to it later. Yeah, we should. Phil's there with his slides as it's all happening very fast. We'll come back to that after, come back to questions later. Super. So Phil, over to you then to start your talk. Thank you very much.
Hang on. I'm just trying to get back to the beginning. Here. Bear with me for a second. Here we go. Right, are we all there?
Yes, lovely.
Okay.
Super, thank you.
Right, I'll start with a major disclaimer. So Penny, I think, said that she wasn't a soil scientist at the beginning, and I most certainly am not either. A lot of the results I'm going to present here really came about by accident in a way. And as part of other work done for other reasons entirely. I am, however, a vegetation scientist, and I do an awful lot of vegetation surveys, condition assessments, NVC, and that sort of thing. So that's where my expertise is. I've had to learn about soils quite rapidly, as I think we probably all ought to be. And the more I have found out, the more I realise I don't know. So I'm suffering very much from a bad case of imposter syndrome. So apologies for that. Acknowledgements. I have to acknowledge all these people who did so much of the work that's gone into all of this. The people who actually went out and did the soil sample collecting and the vegetation surveys, including me, of course. Also see that Claire Cornish is up there, who's part of the organising group for this webinar. Lots of Natural England staff I have to thank as well, past and present, and you know, without them commissioning various surveys, the soil collection work formed part of this wouldn't have happened at all. And of course, all the landowners who let us onto their land. And actually, I do have to thank now, I think I have to thank Penny Anderson very, very deeply, because she's done so much of the background work that's helped me to try and interpret some of the results we've had. So a big cheer to her. And the other acknowledgements, of course, are our friends, the grazing animals. And indeed, without them, I think we wouldn't be considering soils as a store for atmospheric carbon. So the survey rationale, the original objectives of this work were really to investigate soil characteristics, to try and explain the loss of condition, condition in a rather technical sense, meaning the loss of grassland quality, of vegetation quality. It's for those who are not familiar with the idea, it's a way of assessing how management is doing, particularly in SSSI land, but also in other species-rich habitats as well. And condition assessment forms part of what's known as common standards monitoring. And as part of this, back in 2008, I think Natural England came up with a very quick and I say so, quick and dirty method for sampling soils from, particularly from grassland, but also other habitats as well. I'll get on to talking a bit about the limitations of this at the end, I think. So the original objectives were to try and find some sort of soil-based answers for the loss of grassland and other habitat quality. And one thing we did find from this was, as expected, that the levels of available phosphate were really fundamental at determining how good a habitat was. So the higher the available phosphate level in the grassland, for instance, in general, the more species poor that grassland tended to be. And we showed that quite happily, and it was really, you know, reinventing the wheel in many ways. It's what we knew, but it was really important to confirm this. As part of the analysis package, fortunately, we included percentage organic carbon as well. Not thinking back when we started doing these surveys in 2010 that it was going to reveal anything particular. Subsequent experience has told us actually it was very, very fortunate we did, or else I wouldn't be here today talking about the results. And it gave us the opportunity to test relationships between carbon storage in soils. No, I don't say carbon sequestration because we don't measure that. It's simply carbon storage, the amount of carbon there is in a particular vegetation stand type by percentage. So one of the limitations I do have to mention really is that this method, because it's so quick and simple, we were only sampling the uppermost layer of the soil. There's an old joke, I think, which says that somebody stopped his car to ask directions from somebody, and they say, well, if I were you, I wouldn't have started from here. Well, I think if we were redesigning the survey method back in 2008, knowing what we do now, we probably wouldn't have done it in the same way. The method only really samples the top 7.5 centimeters of soil, which is quite unfortunate in a way, because we know now that carbon is stored throughout the soil profile, right down to very, very considerable depth. And that layer of soil only contains a certain amount of carbon, certain proportion of the carbon that's stored in the whole profile. But in general, that top layer is representative of the rest when you compare soils with each other. So it is, I think, a valid measure, although it's not telling us the whole story by any means. Other problems, I think, we didn't really make a huge attempt to standardize between habitats. We could have tried to sample identical vegetation communities in different conditions. We didn't do this because we were trying, I think, to make up for, I suppose, precision of data by sampling as much as possible in the time given. And I think that actually has worked out quite nicely. So making up in quantity what we were losing in precision. And the things we measured when we were out doing the survey work, initially, I'll just describe the various surveys that were included in this. This is actually a meta-analysis I'm going to present now from 6 separate surveys, all of which where the soils were collected in exactly the same way by more or less the same people and analysed by the same laboratory. So we were taking some of the variation out of things. So 6 surveys starting from 2010 and ending up in actually 2020. That should be. All of these reports are out on the Natural England website, I think, as research reports. So it's all in the public domain. All I did for the meta-analysis was simply draw the data together because I still had it. And looking at the number of sites, well, it amounts to about 1,400 vegetation samples from vegetation sampled in the field, vegetation in different conditions, and vegetation under different managements as well. So we have a range of priority habitats across the top here, and the number of samples from each of these in the different surveys, and the number of samples along the bottom from each habitat. And you can see from some habitats we've got quite really good number of samples. So calcareous grassland, lowland meadow, upland meadow, particularly very good representation here. We did sample lowland heathland as well. I'm not really going to talk about that in any great depth from now on because it just simply complicates things. I won't get through it all. And the information we collected from all these vegetation samples, some of these vegetation samples, we collected more than one from each site. So if a site happened to have vegetation in good condition and vegetation in bad condition, we collected a sample from each. The samples themselves followed, the collection method followed the Natural England Technical Information Note 35, taking 25 cores at a minimum from each stand of vegetation, bulking all of these, so you get a representation of the whole area rather than just taking from one particular spot. And collecting a sample of approximately half a kilo, which was enough for the labs to play around with. All of the samples went off to one laboratory, NRM Laboratories in Bracknell, who did a very, very fast turnover of everything and hopefully a very consistent job, reporting on available phosphate, potassium, magnesium, pH, total phosphorus, total nitrogen, loss on ignition, and thankfully percentage carbon, percentage organic carbon. Results from all this were analysed using essentially a blank sheet of paper that is R. If anybody has come across that, it's a massive sort of swimming pool full of sharks that you can plunge into and make the best of as you can. Another very, very fast, very, very rapid learning curve. So I became an instant soil scientist and instant statistician doing a lot of this work, which is good for the brain. Comparing soil variables, so all of those I've just mentioned, with vegetation condition, only on a binary scale, favourable or unfavourable, and a range of management categories as well. These were collected in different intensities in different surveys. Some surveys we sat down with farmers and went through a half hour's worth of questionnaire, taking details of grazing management and hay cutting times and amounts of farmyard manure added. Information actually that's far too complicated to be amenable to analysis, especially where we put the information, where we put all these data sets together. So we were actually reduced to a sort of minimum common standard, which was a basic 6-point scale, I think, 6-point categorical scale. Different types of grazing management, sheep, cattle, mixed grazing, equids, mowing, most of the time with aftermath grazing, or most importantly, unmanaged or undermanaged. So essentially not managed sufficiently to maintain the required vegetation condition, which is a very important category, as we shall see in a minute. And the sorts of habitats we were sampling, it's always nice to have a few pictures in the middle of a slide presentation. So we're looking at lowland dry acidic grasslands, lowland calcareous grasslands, floodplain meadows, of course, and blowing a bit of my own trumpet, those are actually our own cattle grazing grassland we're trying to restore at the moment. Lowland heathland, again, I won't say much more about that. Lowland meadow, and again, so Penny showed sides of her own grass, and this is one of ours that's actually done extremely well over the last 20 years that we've been managing it. Purple moorgrass and rush pasture, and which formed actually the subject of the whole survey in 2020. In the COVID year, we were hoping to spend a lovely summer out surveying upland hay meadows. In the end, we were up there for about a week because we were, at the time, I think the only people not allowed to go to Barnard Castle. And vegetation in poor condition as well. So, yeah, some acidic grassland in poor condition, heathland in poor conditions, one that's been partly converted to a golf course, purple moorgrass and rush pasture with invasive gorse and bracken. And then we ended up with bags and bags and bags, each with about half a kilo of soil in them. So what sort of results did we get from all this? Well, The thing just popped up there that I've had to minimise. Very significant differences between the different priority habitats. Now, bear in mind that these are all percentages of carbon. One of the really annoying things about trying to compare data with other people's studies is that everybody seems to measure their amounts of carbon in different ways. There aren't actually very many studies that look at percentage of organic carbon in soils. Most people tend to seem to measure sort of kilos per square metre or tonnes per hectare. But this is good for comparison in this survey, not necessarily very good for comparison with other people's work. And as you can see, some habitats seem to be storing a lot more carbon than others. And perhaps not unexpectedly, we were seeing the rather organic soils of purple moor grassland rush pasture. So where there's a considerable amount of peat accumulation, we were seeing quite high levels of carbon storage. Also coastal floodplains and grazing marshes, so essentially floodplain grasslands where there's this accumulation, potential annual accumulation of more and more particulate matter every year. Again, very, very high levels of organic carbon. Lower levels in lowland dry acid grassland, lowland meadow, upland meadow, where essentially you've got much more mineral soils. So with a much lower organic fraction, they tend to be soils in at least the lowland meadow, lowland calcareous grasslands, and lowland dry acid grassland, in warmer and drier places than, say, the purple moor grassland rush pasture and coastal floodplain grazing marsh sites. So mineral soils, relatively warm, less carbon storage, those habitats. Then we went to look at try and compare favourable and unfavourable condition grasslands, and that was slightly disappointing. It seemed from that there wasn't actually any difference between essentially good grasslands, good habitats, and bad habitats. That was a bit of a shame, we thought at the time. We shall move on from that to have a quick look at the different management regimes. And yes, actually, that was jolly good. Very, very significant results, significant differences between management types. And the major significant difference was between the undermanaged sites with about a mean of 7% organic carbon in the soil, and sites under cattle grazing, mixed grazing, with around about 10% carbon in the soil, and slightly intermediate levels for other management types here, so pony, horse grazing, sheep grazing, and mowing with aftermath grazing as well. Mainly aftermath grazing. We didn't actually separate the two because we didn't collect enough information to send some of the surveys. So this may well include simply just mown sites. So then what I thought was a good idea is to have a look at different priority habitats, break the data set down into subsets to see if there was any difference between vegetation in different conditions within the different priority habitats. And actually, yes, so we did get some very significant results here. So in lowland meadow particularly, and this is particularly important, of course, because lowland grasslands do occupy a very, very large part of the country. So the potential for restoration from unfavourable to favourable condition is quite massive here. And yes, we got some very nice significant results here. We're talking about quite a large sample size, which is quite fortunate. So we managed to detect differences. Also in upland hay meadows as well, there was also a significant difference, which is very encouraging. So it means there's a lot of potential here for improved carbon storage through grassland restoration. And this is actually all very encouraging, because this is largely in agreement with a lot of other work that has been done on carbon storage, particularly in grasslands. There are some very interesting studies that have shown very close relationships between vegetation species richness and carbon storage. There's an excellent experiment in Germany looking at restoration of floodplain grassland from scratch, really, and showing rapid carbon sequestration rates, but which are very closely related to species richness of the established grasslands. And a couple of other pieces of work as well, which I think which the results from these surveys bear out quite nicely. Essentially, what we're doing here is some very rapid, coarse-scale field testing of work that's been done experimentally with much greater precision. And I'm very encouraged by the fact that it all seems to be, all the results seem to be very supportive of each other. So I think this demonstrates quite nicely that in the field in Britain, the value of semi-natural and species-rich grasslands, in particular for carbon storage. Other work that's been done has shown particularly that the deep-rooted species, so swards rich in deep-rooted species, are particularly good. I think Penny was talking about the value of red clover, for instance, Trifolium pratense in grassland swards. Now, red clover is quite an interesting one. Its importance might be twofold, I think. So its importance is both as a legume, so it's introducing more nitrogen into the system, but it's also very deep-rooted. I mean, the roots of red clover have been found going down to about 3 meters, which is quite a contrast to other trifolium species like white clover, which tends to be very much in the topsoil. But I don't think we shouldn't really overstate the importance of red clover on its own. I think it's a whole suite of deep-rooted species, legumes, and others. Other work has shown the importance of centaurea species, knapweeds, another deep tap-rooted thing, which is a very common constituent of semi-natural grasslands in Britain. The role of that in carbon storage. So I think one of the main lessons we have to learn from this is that our extensively managed grasslands, particularly the species-rich ones, are extremely important for grassland, for carbon storage in grasslands, for carbon storage as a whole. I mean, it has been suggested that the addition of a certain amount of nitrogen to a grassland soil can actually improve carbon storage. I think you have to set that against the fact that addition of nitrogen to grasslands actually can diminish species richness as well. So the two things play off against each other. Again, we're back to the role of clovers in species-rich grasslands. Their role is fixing nitrogen, and actually the amount of nitrogen that is fixed by trifolium species in the species-rich, extensively managed grassland is more or less, it's quite analogous to the amount of nitrogen that might be added to a grassland as artificial fertilizer at a low rate. And I think in recent years, we've seen, or last year or two particularly, we've seen the costs of artificial fertilizer going up and up, and probably out of the reach of many, particularly less intensive farmers in Britain. So I think the role of clover is very much there. Talking about deep-rooted species, though, one of the very important elements of grassland condition is the presence of invasive species, or rapidly growing invasive weedy species. It has actually been shown that some of these, so dock docks, rumex species, for instance, and creeping thistle can actually have a very detrimental effect on carbon storage by introducing, via their very deep rooting systems, introducing nitrogen into soils at depth and stimulating microbial activity and actually releasing carbon. So it's very important to try and maintain semi-natural grasslands free of some of these invasive weedy species. So there's a lot more potential in these data sets. I've really only scratched the surface with the meta-analysis. We could go much more deeply into using some of the data into looking at the vegetation communities using the NVC, the National Vegetation Classification. And there are some preliminary results to show that different vegetation communities do actually have significantly different quantities, percentages of organic carbon associated with them. So there's more that can be done here. And yes, so certainly refining the data, looking at soil texture, which have some information on as well. But in conclusion, I think I'd just like to reiterate that let's skip that. The importance of semi-natural grasslands for carbon storage, the importance of restoring semi-natural grasslands for carbon storage. When after all, we have, I think, an approximately more than 3 million hectares of grassland in Britain, of which only a tiny amount is species rich. And I think Penny mentioned a figure of 941,000 hectares being semi-natural. So there's a huge amount of potential for restoring our agricultural grasslands for something approaching more favourable condition, ideally to much greater species richness. There are obstacles in this, of course, the availability of native seed, for instance, and it's very easy to get hold of red clover seed, but most of it's agricultural cultivars, which may well not be anything like as good. But yes, huge potential for grassland restoration, with all the benefits that go with that, quite apart from the carbon storage benefits. More extensive management of our grasslands to help maintain species richness and their ecosystem services. So reducing grazing pressure, heavy grazing pressure is not necessarily very good for carbon storage. So more extensive management, particularly I think cattle and mixed grazing is potentially very beneficial. Perhaps we do need to start considering reducing meat consumption. Certainly wouldn't advocate large-scale veganism. Great as a personal choice, but I think, you know, with a wholesale abandonment of grazing livestock, we would actually be seeing a rather wholesale liberation of greenhouse gases from the soil. Reduced meat consumption perhaps would increase our consumption of high-quality meat. Obviously, this had implications for the affordability of it. I think that has to be addressed as well. You know, it's going to be very unfair if we made meat something that was only available to the rich. No tree planting on grassland, very carefully targeted tree planting. It's great around the margins of fields, and in our relatively wet climates in Britain, the traditional model of open fields surrounded by nice, thick, dense hedges, where you have the tree component, is an ideal model, I think. And so there's huge potential for restoration. And one of the things we really do need to do is to prevent carbon from moving from the longer term geological cycles into the shorter term agricultural cycles and the atmospheric cycle. So essentially, I think our priority is to keep carbon in the geological cycle where it belongs. So to reduce our consumption of fossil fuels, to end forest destruction, to end peatland drainage, all of which are incredibly destructive to climate. And I think it's not necessarily the job of agriculture to minimise these. It's the job of our much wider behaviour and lifestyle as people to do that. But agriculture certainly can play a role and can certainly minimise its own impacts. So thank you very much. I think I should stop there probably and go over to the question and answer session.
Great. Thank you very much, Philip, for that, for your talk and sharing your data with us. We will go over to the questions and answers now. So if all of the panel want to switch their cameras back on, I can see you've been typing away answers in the background busily to some of the questions. And I think if either Matt or Claire want to start with the questions that you've been grouping together.
There were quite a lot of quite technical questions on there, and it was great that people were able to chip in and answer some of those questions, because they were some very quite specific questions. I'll start with a fairly open sort of general question. There was one there about woodlands and the sort of difference between why woodlands take so long to start sequestering carbon compared to grasslands. So I don't know if that's a sort of general question that people could.
Yes, Penny, that's something you mentioned. Do you want to comment on that? The question was, is it because of the carbon, what's expended in order to produce the trees, or is it something going on in the soils on the site, please?
No, some of the papers that I've read, it's definitely what's going on in the soils, and it's going to be partially to do with depending what sort of afforestation is carrying out. And as I said, a lot of the research has been done by forest research, so you're talking about large scale afforestation plantations, and a lot of that's actually the ground is prepared by ploughing or some sort of ploughing. It's not necessarily complete ploughing now. Sometimes there's a sort of reversal of just the blob that the tree is put in, and then there's going to be fertilization and things like that as well. So those are things that are actually damaging the carbon that's already in the soils, made much worse if it's on organic soils to start with. So one of the questions that was asked was, did it include actually the production of the trees? And the answer was no, it's not the carbon involved in actually the nurseries and things. But the other thing is that a tree, if you plant a tree, it actually takes quite a long time for its roots to develop, for its root mass to develop, for it to actually start functioning, for it actually to acquire its fungi, because most of them are going to have ectomycorrhizal fungi, which are essential. And all of that takes time. So the trees are actually not producing a significant canopy, a significant leaf fall, contributing to the carbon in the soil for 20, 30 years. And when you get a tree, and they'll be different because some trees grow quicker and shorter life cycle than others. And so the Forestry Commission are not talking about your silver birch and your Guelder rose and things like that, which we might be as ecologists. So what you're doing is waiting from the afforestation point of view for those trees to reach closing of the canopy stage is the sort of maximum growth stage, and that's when they're actually going to be growing fastest and adding more carbon to the soil. So it just takes time, because trees, don't grow tomorrow. They grow over a number of decades until they reach that. And then there has been some suggestion that some of the research I found shows that ancient semi-natural woodland can actually continue to capture carbon, to sequestrate carbon over up to 400 years. This is the oldest one, but no management, no disturbance, which was actually in China. But nevertheless, there's been work done in Europe and England as well, although not necessarily quite so old, knowing that they're quite so old. But they're still sequestrating significant amounts of carbon in a couple of hundred years from at least of knowledge of their age, which is really useful actually. So it's just a matter of building up time, but it also depends on what carbon's in the soils to start with, because if it's high in organic rich soils, they're going to continue losing carbon. And I've seen plantations, look at the flow country, for example, and I've seen plantations like that in less wet peat, deeply drained peat, which is going to continue losing carbon through several cycles of growth and may not actually get to the point where the trees are compensating what's being lost at the same time after those peaty soils. So trees on organic rich soils and on peat is a no-no.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
I'd like to just add something to that. In the sort of lowland farming situation, essentially, if you plant some trees, essentially what you've done is create an abandoned grassland with a few twigs in it. So the processes of management are no longer going on. You're accumulating a lot of sort of rotting down leaf litter on the soil surface, which is all off-gassing. You're losing species richness. So your typical farmland tree planting is a Arenatherum-dominated species poor grassland, waiting 30 odd years before it starts storing any decent carbon. And we don't have that 30 years.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Shall we take the next question, please?
It's just quite a nice follow-on question, actually, Carol, in fact, because there were several people asking about the process of restoration, and obviously, having to go in there and disturb the soil in a possibly in a semi-natural sort of situation. So if to overseed and get seed established. So I'm just interested to hear the panel's sort of view on that, and whether that sort of minimum tillage or light disturbance, how much carbon is that going to release, and is that a problem?
Am I going first again?
If you want to, Penny, yes, for that bit. We've got lots of animal questions to come for the others.
Oh, good. Well, I won't be answering them. I can feel completely guilty at this as well, because quite a lot of my habitat creation and restoration work precedes the concern about carbon. So on one field, for example, I actually herbicided off the vegetation without removing it. It was a drought year, quite a long time ago, not 2018. So we raked all the dead grass off, just piled in a heap. Actually, the badgers took it away, and then we oversowed that with seed, which actually worked quite well. And we tined it. So we tined it first. So I think just in general terms, I mean, the Natural England's tin, whichever number it is, recommends something like 50 to 70% bare ground, doesn't it, in order to actually get your seed established. Yeah. But if you can achieve that by some superficial method, trying to use tining of some sort, or a superficial harrowing, you might need to take your hay cut off. If you take an ordinary hay cut off first, although you need to take it really late because you're seeding late. You don't want to be seeding in July. So that actually does cut your material right down to the ground and leaves little bits of bare ground visible, doesn't it? But if you then were to tine that in whatever is suitable to your soils and your situation, and there's lots of different harrowing type machines and tine type machines that you could use, then that's the best way without actually disturbing significantly the soil surface. But there will be times when that won't work, and so you're going to be then losing your carbon for a short period of time in order to establish that grassland, which is going to be in time going to be of better value in all ways.
Great, so that's one step back to take 2 steps forward, or 10 steps forward. Yeah, great.
But we've got no measurements really of that on a short time scale.
Does anybody else want to come in there?
Yeah, the other method that we've certainly used is using green hay and using livestock to prepare the ground. Grazing it down to virtually nothing. Then spreading, it doesn't take very long really. A decent herd of cattle will do it in a week or so. Then spreading green hay on, getting the cattle to eat that and trample it in. So I'm sure the overgrazing phase of that will actually lose a bit of carbon, but probably, I don't know. Do we actually have the results? Do we have any data?
You've got to be really careful not to compact your soils. So it really does depend on the soils if you can do it that way.
So do we thank?
And the other thing, of course, is introducing plug plants, which doesn't really have to lose any carbon at all. And I'm sure Claire knows all about that, don't you?
We use quite a lot of plug plants, yes. So you don't have to cultivate the whole surface of the field, just a really small area to get your plug plants in.
The other thing is to do a part of a field or do strips or do plots, with the expectation, if the conditions are right, that the species will spread out, which I've certainly seen with things like yellow rattle, and we've done it a lot in a recent project here in the Peak, Southwest Peak too.
Yeah.
Good. Thank you all very much. Bill's going to come off mute now and talk to us about, I know you're using hay and bale grazing and things, aren't you?
Yes, that's right, Caroline, and it's really an extension of what Phil was just describing, but rather than wasting a crop of hay and hoping you get some seed in it, we use the hay itself. So we make the hay, we bale it, and we feed it in the winter on a field where there aren't enough species, hoping that the hay with the species will bring the seed. And the animals, I mean, this is nature's way of doing it. They tread the seed in. So provided that you spread the hay round to all the different parts of the field, the animals come and eat it up. They remove all the material, and the seed is left in the surface of the ground, and it's just nicely trodden in. They create a bit of gap around it to remove the competition in the spring, and you can actually see these seedlings appearing in the bits of bare ground when the spring comes around next year. So I'm a great fan of making these things as cheap and as efficient as possible. And if you're a farmer, I see Phil approves of that idea. So that's another way. And I mean, we don't have any data to show what impact that has on the carbon store in those fields, but we have measured soil carbon in our meadows, and they certainly haven't gone down, having been subject to that process.
Yes, so if that's part of it, so thank you very much, Bill. Lisa, do you want to comment then on how that might work as part of a rotational mob grazing, more regenerative sort of grazing system? Or
I was going to say exactly what Bill said, really, that bale grazing seems to be a very effective way of getting more species into your sward. And actually some of the farmers in the PFLA are allowing tall grass to grow, and that often means that flowers are actually flowering and seeding, and you do actually get small seedlings growing in those tall grass fields, because there's a little bit of soil, exposed soil available, because the animals are in there. So definitely having animals within the system works really well at getting your plant seeds planted and growing.
Good, thank you very much. That's really interesting. Perhaps that's something we can flag up, make a note of, taking some measurements before people transform their system to that kind of grazing pattern, and then monitoring over time. That's something that we could do to gather data, I guess. Okay, so the next topic, please.
I've got a question about wet neutral grassland from Delphine. So on wet neutral grassland, does floral diversity have any benefits for carbon sequestration? I suppose the question is there. It's wet grassland, so it will be better at storing carbon anyway than dry grassland. Is the floral diversity adding to that?
I would say absolutely yes. The experiment I referred to from in Germany is actually looking at a floodplain grassland. Which
is that the Jena?
Yeah, that's the one. And the results from that are quite dramatic, I think. Very, very close association between species richness and carbon sequestration and carbon storage. So, yeah. But I'm sure actually that the Floodplain Meadows Partnership people will, I hope they'd confirm that. I don't know.
I think, yes, good. Okay, so we've got somebody on the call this evening here who might be able to comment on that.
Olivia's here
chat.
today.
So great. Thank you very much.
I've got one about conservation grazing. I'm going to roll two questions together, if that's all right, from Kate B and Steve T. How can we show that conservation grazing can be used to capture carbon and provide nature-based solutions, specifically on high clay content soils and limestone grassland? Because the carbon arguments against meat are usually based on data from grain-fed systems. So I've rolled two questions together there. There's a gnarly one.
Bill, do you want to start on that, and then we'll go to Lisa?
Don't get me started.
How can we show?
We have to get the evidence, and so the work that Lisa's done with the CEcol project is definitely a good start, and I'm aware of other work that's going on at Rothamsted and elsewhere. And if you spend your time looking on the internet for this evidence, it's certainly there. But the trouble is that there is so much media attention focused on the damaging impacts, particularly of ruminant livestock, that it's difficult to get this message across. And the thing that most worries me is to read that one of the wildlife trusts is reviewing its grazing management policies because it feels that it's causing them to have too high a carbon footprint. And then I see an interview with David Attenborough where he says he's decided to give up eating red meat because of the damage it's causing. So that to me just highlights what a difficult situation we have if we're trying to demonstrate the crucial role that ruminant livestock have in restoring the world to some kind of sanity.
Yeah, I have a suspicion. I've not done the maths at all, and I may be totally wrong, but if we actually reduce the intensivity of our livestock management, we could actually be seeing a carbon neutral agricultural situation. If we can eliminate the input of fossil fuels in all their forms to our livestock management systems. I think I'd need to do the maths to show that, and maybe I wouldn't be able to, but I just have a feeling in the back of my mind that could actually be the situation.
There are
okay,
people,
thank you, Lisa. Over to you.
There are people doing that maths now, and some of them are using the data that we collected from the pasture-fed livestock farms. They're doing a project for DEFRA, which I think will be much more nuanced instead of in terms of life cycle analysis. It won't be just looking at cattle that are produced from feedlots or from intensive systems. It will be looking at cattle produced from much less intensive systems, and I think the answers will be somewhat different to what we've seen, which will be good and useful, I think, for everyone to have a much better understanding. But I think that there is very little work on places like where Bill farms with cattle breeds that are much more attuned to their environment, and inevitably there's going to be quite a different picture in terms of the carbon that comes from those systems compared to systems where feed comes from another country very often, which is heavily fertilized, or and that they're also produced perhaps indoors entirely on feed and very little on grass. So yes, I think that, as Bill says, there is evidence already out there. We just perhaps need it to gain a bit more profile before we start to trust again that grass-fed systems are actually doing a pretty good job in terms of carbon management.
Sorry, I was just going to say, one of the things that any of us could do, there are lots of tools on the internet where you can go and do your own personal carbon footprint. And I've had a go with a couple of these because I wanted to test this assertion that the most useful thing any of us could do to help climate change is to give up red meat. And when I've actually been, and I went to, one of them was the WWF tool, and I entered all my data with red meat consumption, and then I entered all the same data saying I was a vegan. I lied, and it made exactly 3% difference to my carbon footprint. And clearly there were lots of other things that I could have put that would have increased or decreased my input much more than that minuscule 3%. So that might be something, if you're interested in this question, that any of you could try.
We ought to be thinking about not eating beef, not that I do, but eating beef from places like Brazil, places where they're actually destroying the forest and growing soy, and also soya-fed animals, because a lot of that's actually and palm oil. Think of those longer lengths of in the chain, if you think, if you like, and the high quality production of particularly organic meat in this country should be something we should be supporting, but not where it involves the destruction of really important habitats, particularly some of those in the oil palm countries, actually deep peat, which they're deeply draining, and that's the stuff that's been on fire if you've been for decades.
Okay, thank you. So I'm going to bring this back, bring the questions back from, I think I'd like to refer everybody to a very good talk that Fidelity Weston of the PFLA gave recently to the Food Policy Research Institute. Bill, you were involved with that, which kind of highlighted this and set things in context based on a lot of Lisa's research and other people. So that could be an interesting watch. We could put the link to that in perhaps later on. Have we got some more? We've only got 5 minutes left now, and we were going to ask everybody, are there any more pressing questions from Claire or Matt before we ask everybody on the panel for their top tip of what Bill's already said what we might do next, one thing, which is really interesting. Are there any other questions particularly?
I mean, there were quite a lot of questions around pasture-fed systems, and I know that some of those were answered on the chat there. And I suppose that it seems that there obviously is bits and pieces of contradictory evidence out there, and the evidence is not perhaps as clear-cut as we would like it to be. So it's not a given, is it? I don't think that just because you're in a pasture-fed system that you're going to be sequestering more carbon than not. But I'd be interested in comment on that from people here.
Yes, no, Lisa, I mean, how about how you manage your grass? And you can feed grass that's never rested, and can't you? That's from a set stocking system. How is that different from a well-rested?
Well, I would say that we did look at a good sample of pasture-fed farms, and we looked at their soil carbon against wider countryside soil carbon, and it wasn't significantly different overall. But if you look at the soil carbon, it's highly variable, depends on where you are, what soil type you're on, and all sorts of factors. So I think that the one thing we did found is that the longer farmers had been pasture-fed livestock farmers, the higher their soil carbon tended to be. So that was another factor that we were looking at, very variable. Some people had just started being pasture-fed, some people have been doing it for 10 years or more. So it may be that the longer you get into those practices and you're not putting fertilizer on, a lot of farmers didn't, and feed itself has got loads of phosphorus in it. It's a huge pollutant of soils, but yeah, phosphorus is another matter. But soil carbon is, our grasslands have high soil carbon in this country, even our improved grasslands. I saw one question in there about that. They can also have high soil carbon, and the difference between neutral and improved grassland is not massive from the countryside survey. They're fairly similar. So yeah, we do already have very good soil carbon in this country. We grow grass very well. If grazing practices, we're looking at grazing practices to see if you do grow your grass taller, do you also get deeper roots, and are you then getting higher levels of carbon in the soil? But that's going to take a long time. Soil scientists will tell us that it takes a really long time to really change your carbon profile, apart from in that very top bit, which can be a bit quicker. But yeah, we already have very good soil carbon in our soils in this country. We just need to preserve it and make sure we don't lose it through ploughing or mismanagement.
Good, thank you very much. Well, I'm going to have to draw things to a close now. I think very frustrating with when the discussion's going. We could go on for a lot longer, but we'll be able to see the questions and answers, and I hope we'll be able to continue a lot of these discussions either on the Nibblers Forum for those of you involved in that, or through PFLA and the many other grazing discussion groups that are going on around the country. There's been a lot of information and ideas for us to digest this evening. So I'm going to just summarize really and just say how I think there's clearly a long way to go yet before we can work out exactly how we're going to measure grassland carbon with the sort of scientific rigor and in a cost-effective way as well. I have to Natural England clearly get a very good deal on soil analysis compared to us lesser mortals out there in the commercial world, but it's something that we ought to think about how we're going to fund all this work as well. So our final request to everybody this evening is that if there are soil scientists, we know there are some here this evening, and others working in the field who would like to be involved in the next stage of this discussion and pulling together a plan, really drawing together aims and objectives for the way we go forward, then we'd like to hear from you. in the next, by the end of the week, really, just if, in principle, if you're interested to be involved. We plan to crystallise these aims and objectives and consider the existing sampling techniques that people are using, perhaps at greater depth of the Natural England data that Phil had access to do this meta-analysis. They were working at 7.5 centimetres. We know that other soil carbon sampling is, as Penny said, is mostly at depths of, say, 30 centimetres and in sometimes deeper. So we'd like to know who's doing what at the moment and hopefully agree a protocol so that meadow makers and everybody else interested in the transformation of species poor swards to species rich swards can get involved as well. So if you want to be part of this next stage, which we don't think will be very onerous, it's going to be just, another short session to establish where we go next. Please email Claire Cornish, as I said, by the end of this week. Her email is coming up in the chat now for you to take note of that. And I'd like to say that it's Claire's enthusiasm for this whole topic that was the catalyst for this event. So a very big thank you to Claire for that, for setting us off on this path.
That was from Penny's paper, which was incredibly inspiring.
Absolutely. And thank you to Matt and Isabel and Plant Life for hosting this webinar. Thank you to everybody for coming along. And thank you, as you say, Claire, quite rightly, to Penny for your paper drawing things together and helping us to see, get our heads up from our day-to-day jobs and look at the broader perspective. I think that's such a valuable thing to do, and every time I go back to it I see something else and it sets a whole load of new thoughts going. So thank you very, very much for that, and thank you to Philip for drawing together this analysis of this vast data set. We look forward to seeing the paper when it's published. Where and when might we be seeing that, Phil? Or no, I mean, in British Wildlife, did you say, or is it going to? It's going to Natural England first to publish.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's the actual analysis and the basic paper is with them at the moment. But
great.
Just that there's so much more I can do with all this.
Yes, I'm sure.
But time, really. Yes,
thank you very, very much for your input. We've had, finally, I should say, we've had some very thought-provoking questions. Some researchers and field practitioners have asked things like, when's our carbon strategy going to be ready, and all these kind of things. Those are political and scientific questions that I think we're all lobbying for, aren't we, to try and move this debate on. We know that there's a lot of work going on about carbon generally, and for Grasslands, it's Plant Life and other organisations' role, I think, to really promote that in the future. And thank you all very much for coming this evening, and good night.
Thank you.